Hi, if this is your first time with us, I'm Marcy. This is Freya. She's 3 years old and has a rare syndrome called Cornelia de Lange Syndrome. And I just wanted to talk to you about our diagnosis journey. It was not as straightforward as I was hoping it would be, or the doctors were hoping it would be, and definitely a little bit different than most diagnosis stories for kids with syndromes. I want to start with my pregnancy. I did get the blood test during pregnancy to tell me if there was any chromosomal abnormalities. That was negative, no chromosomal abnormalities. Everything was negative. So I went along with my pregnancy. If you didn't watch, I had a pregnancy story. You guys can go back to that and hear a little bit more about that. But I did have a lot of issues during my pregnancy, and they were suspecting that Freya had a genetic syndrome. They wanted to do an amniocentesis when I was pregnant, which I declined. I didn't want to take the risks associated with that. I just figured we'd wait until she was born, do some testing then. So she was born. The geneticist came to the NICU to have a chat with me, and she basically said, people don't like me. I only bring people bad news, so here we go. I think she has this called Cornelia de Lange Syndrome. Don't Google it because it's a horrible syndrome and you'll just get depressed. Let's wait for the results to see. And that was it. She pointed out everything that she thought was abnormal on Freya. Her eyebrows, her beautiful long eyelashes, her thin lips, which as a new mom was heartbreaking. Everything she pointed out was something that I saw in my family tree. Her dad has very, very thick eyebrows. So when I look at her eyebrows, I see Chris. My mom, who had died 5 years before Freya was born, had the very thin lips. And so when I looked at her thin lips, I saw my mom. The dark, thick hair was also from my mom. Her dad also has dark, thick hair. So to have a doctor come in and point all these things out as abnormalities and as something that most kids don't have was just like heartbreaking. It was like she was pointing out all of Freya's flaws, and everything she saw as a flaw, I saw as beautiful and perfect. Yes. Yes. Everything is beautiful and perfect, huh? So, she said, let's do this test to see if she has Cornelia de Lange Syndrome. And we had to wait 6 weeks for those results. So we took Freya home. She was doing great. She was gaining weight. We were slowly working toward her eating out of a bottle instead of her feeding tube. And she was hitting milestones. So we went back to get the results of the test from the geneticist, and it was negative. So I thought, well, she doesn't have it then. And so at that point, the geneticist agreed maybe it could be a different syndrome. So we did different tests for different syndromes. We ended up doing eight different tests, I think, for 8 different genetic syndromes, all of which were negative. So I really thought that Freya must not have a syndrome because we had looked forever. When she turned probably about 9 months, I went to a different geneticist to get a second opinion. Because at that point she was falling behind in milestones. She wasn't gaining enough weight. She was eating really good, but everything else was kind of falling behind. So I went to a different geneticist at our children's hospital, and they actually brought in a team of geneticists. There was 4 of them, and they all came to look at Freya, and they all kind of agreed, it looks like she has Cornelia de Lange syndrome. And at that point, they decided to do a test, not of her blood, but of a cheek swab. And they explained to me that the vascular system is the first thing to develop when you are pregnant. And so if the gene mutated after her vascular system developed, then she could be positive for Cornelia de Lange syndrome everywhere else, but not in her blood, because the gene wasn't mutated when that was formed. So I was like, okay, let's do it. So we went and did that, waited 6 weeks for the results. Freya was probably about 16 months old at the time, and got the results back, negative again. So at that point, we were kind of working under the assumption that she did have Cornelia de Lange syndrome, but it was a gene that they hadn't associated with Cornelia de Lange syndrome yet. Cornelia de Lange syndrome has 8, maybe 7 or 8 genes associated with it so far. And the latest one that they found just recently. And so they just were going under the assumption she probably has a gene change that will be discovered in the future to be linked with Cornelia de Lange syndrome, but just hasn't yet. So we decided that was it, that we just would go under the assumption she had Cornelia de Lange syndrome. I contacted the Cornelia de Lange Syndrome Foundation to get more information, to get more papers to give to my doctors and everything like that. And they suggested we do something called a whole exome sequence. And basically what they do there is they take my blood, they take Freya's dad's blood, they take Freya's blood. And in those 3 samples, they will kind of cross match and see which genes don't match up with mine and Chris's genes, because she should get half her genes from me and half of them from dad. So together they should match up completely. So we decide we're gonna do this. This was a year ago in October. So October 2021. And we go do the blood test. I honestly am like, this is the last thing. If this is negative, we're just gonna keep on going. Like, we're not gonna do any more tests. This is exhausting. This has been, at this point, like a 2.5-year journey, and I was so done. So we go do the test. We set up an appointment with the geneticist, which was a Zoom appointment, and decide this is it. So we go into the Zoom appointment, and the doctor smiles and he says, "Marcy, I have some good news for you," which usually means the doctors will say the tests are negative, which, you know, in our case is not good news. Like, I want to know the answer. And so I kind of sighed and I was like, okay, what? And he said, Freya has Cornelia de Lange syndrome. And just that doctor understanding that I needed these answers and saying that it was good news, that we knew what was going on, he was an amazing doctor. I had never met with him before, but he just knew. And he said her gene changes on the NIPBL gene, which is the most common gene for Cornelia de Lange syndrome. So of course my next question is like, why the heck did we not find it before? What happened on the other 2 tests? How was that negative? And he went on to explain to me that Freya has a gene change, not on the gene, but on the it's called a splice site. And on this gene, it splices proteins together to go out through the body. So you need certain proteins for your liver, you need certain proteins for your heart, you need certain proteins for your brain. And this gene will splice different proteins together to go to different parts of the body. And her change was on one of the splice sites. There's many splice sites throughout the genes. So on one single splice site, on the NIPBL gene, she has a mutation. He went on to explain to me that Freya is the only known person to have this change on this specific splice site. There are other kids that have them on different splice sites, but this specific splice site, Freya is the only person in the world known. There could be kids out there that haven't had this test done. The only one that is known to have this certain gene change. So 2.5 years after she was born, we finally have our answer. And it was a very long process. And I'm just so thankful for this doctor who decided he wasn't going to give up and decided, you know, he wanted to get us some answers. And since we had the diagnosis, when we got the diagnosis, there was a sense of relief. Like, we finally know I get to be a part of the CDLS community, which is amazing and supportive, and I loved everyone. I had already been a part of the community, and part of me was so scared that she would have something else and I wouldn't get to stay in this community. And then there was also a big part of me that grieved really hard, because even though we kind of knew it was Cornelia de Lange syndrome, now we knew for sure. And Cornelia de Lange syndrome will just present a lot of difficulties throughout her life, a lot of delays. And so I took my time to grieve the diagnosis while simultaneously being so excited we had the diagnosis and I could stay a part of this community. And it meant that we knew exactly what we needed to do for Freya to help her. So if you have gotten a diagnosis and feel yourself feeling both of these like polar opposite feelings simultaneously, it's totally normal. And it doesn't mean you love your kid any less. I love Freya. I will do anything for Freya. But it also means that we will have a different life than I had pictured for myself. And when I wrote my story, having a child with a disability was not a part of that story. Having a child with a ultra rare syndrome, and even within that syndrome, she's the only one that has this specific genetic mutation. That was not a part of my story. But here we are. We don't get to write our own stories. We get to live the life we are given. And so now I really do try to live the life I was given with joy and find the good parts, while also giving myself space to grieve the parts that I would not have picked for myself. So thanks for being here on this quick sum up of Freya's diagnosis journey that took years and years. I hope you'll come back next time. You want to say goodbye, Freya? Oh, goodbye. We're going to go get her down for her nap.